An American warship seizes an Iranian vessel moving toward the Gulf of Oman. Within minutes, crew jumps, stocks fall, and the ceasefire that everybody keeps talking about suddenly starts looking like paper. That is the scene I want you to hold in your mind. Not an abstract chart, not a macro thesis, not a policy memo. A ship is taken. Oil jumps, equities roll over. The ceasefire turns into theater because the real story is not the ship by itself. The real story is that Iran is trying to force the world to see something Washington does not want the world to see clearly in a chokepoint war, physical collateral, kind of discipline a paper empire. That is the warning. And that is why this moment is much more dangerous. Most people are still reading this as a military story, a blockade, a seizure, a retaliation cycle, more drones, more statements, more chest, beating, fine, great powers know how to live inside that vocabulary. They can stay inside it for months. Iran is trying to move the war out of that vocabulary. It is saying, your system runs on paper confidence, but my leverage sits next to real barrels, real lanes, real refineries, real shipping time, and real scarcity. That is a bigger battlefield. I want to give you one framework for understanding it. Paper collateral versus physical collateral. Treasuries are paper collateral, powerful paper collateral, central paper collateral, system, defining paper collateral, but still paper. They are claims on future safety. They are valuable because the world believes the structure underneath them remains stable. Oil is physical collateral. Hormuz is physical collateral. Bab el Mandeb is physical collateral. A pipeline is physical collateral. Jet fuel is physical collateral. A refinery schedule is physical collateral. The modern financial system likes to pretend paper comes first. That is only true in normal times, as long as ships move, as long as crude flows, as long as inflation is calm, as long as the Fed still has room, paper can keep pricing the future. But chokepoint wars reverse the order. When real routes shake, the physical starts repricing the paper. That is what happened in the market the moment the ship was seized. The market did not care mainly about that one cargo. It immediately priced the real issue. If enforcement hardens in Hormuz, every future barrel now carries more military risk, more insurance risk, more delay risk, and more inflation risk. That is why oil moved first. And once oil moves first, the rest of the chain begins. That chain is the whole story. Higher oil keeps inflation alive. Sticky inflation keeps rates high. High rates make refinancing harder. Harder refinancing makes treasury management uglier. Ugly treasury management weakens confidence in the very paper. America needs the world to keep trusting. That is the chain Iran is trying to weaponize. This is why the IMF warning matters so much, even though most people are treating it like background noise. If the safe haven premium on U.S. treasuries is weakening, if investors are no longer giving American sovereign paper the same effortless psychological premium it used to enjoy, then this war becomes much more dangerous for Washington than the Pentagon language admits. Because now the war is pressing on the exact point where the American system is already sensitive, not just inflation, not just oil funding, rollovers, duration, confidence. That gets even more dangerous if the Treasury has leaned too far into short-term issuance, because then the whole system is making one giant hidden bet. It is betting that short rates will come down. It is betting that inflation will cool in time. It is betting that the physical world will calm down before the paper world has to refinance itself at a much uglier price. Iran sees that bet. That is what makes its message more sophisticated than people realize. Iran is not just saying, we can hurt your ships. It is saying, we can force your paper empire to answer to the physical world. That is much harder. Hormuz alone is enough to shake the global system, but Iran's leverage does not stop at Hormuz. The moment Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea enter the same calculation, this stops being a Gulf crisis and becomes a global transport crisis that matters. Because once flows are rerouted or compressed through fewer lanes, the whole downstream system starts tightening. Pipelines matter more, receiving terminals matter more, pumping stations matter more, insurance spreads matter more, refinery timing matters more, product shortages matter more. This is why the jet fuel angle matters. Most people hear that Europe could face a serious jet fuel strain and think it is some narrow airline problem. It is not. It is a signal that the product chain is more fragile than the financial commentary wants to admit. Once aviation, freight, tourism, and industrial logistics start feeling the same squeeze, the war leaves the Middle East in people's minds. Now it is not a war over there. Now it is a war inside prices, inside travel, inside household budgets, inside central bank timing, and democratic governments lose room very quickly. Once wars become inflation stories, that is exactly why Washington is trapped. If it tightens the blockade harder, it raises the very oil pressure that makes the inflation and treasury story worse. If it eases off, Iran proves that chokepoint leverage works. If it widens the war in the name of solving the Iran problem permanently, then the China question moves from the background to the center. And that may be the most reckless branch of all, because more and more voices in Washington are saying openly what used to remain half. Hidden, maybe Iran is not the final target. Maybe the deeper logic is China. Cut Beijing off from Iranian oil, disrupt Chinese trade through the Gulf, raise China's energy costs, turn Middle Eastern pressure into a China strategy. On paper, you can see the attraction. In reality, it may be strategic self-harm because Washington keeps making the same mistake. It keeps imagining China as if it were strategically isolated. China is not isolated. Every serious effort to squeeze Beijing's energy position creates stronger incentives for Russia and China to integrate faster, not slower. Every effort to cut Chinese access to Gulf energy raises the value of Russian substitution. Every shock teaches Eurasian powers the same lesson. Root around the American system while you still can. That is where this war can start doing damage in two directions at once. In the short run, America gets inflation stress, debt stress, and market stress. In the medium run, America accelerates dollarization habits, alternative settlement behavior, and a wider global appetite for reducing dependence on U.S. Controlled financial plumbing. That is how empires accidentally educate the world against themselves, not by disappearing, by weaponizing their advantages so aggressively that everyone else starts building exits. This is why I do not dismiss Iran's warning as just propaganda. Yes, it is propaganda, but it is propaganda anchored to a real structural vulnerability. America's paper supremacy still depends on a world where physical flows remain stable enough to justify trust in paper. Chokepoint wars attack that relationship. They push oil higher. They keep inflation alive. They make rates harder. They complicate debt management. They weaken safe haven psychology. And they remind the world of a very old truth. A paper empire still rests on a physical world. Once that becomes visible, the real question is no longer whether America can seize another ship. Of course it can. The real question is whether it can keep the physical system calm enough to preserve the credibility of the paper collateral at the center of its empire. That is why the real story is not who controls one vessel. The real story is who gets to price reality. That is the bigger fight now. And when you look at it that way, Washington's option tree becomes brutally clear. It can double down, tighten enforcement, and try to break Iran before the financial consequences become politically intolerable. That is the cleanest fantasy. But it assumes the physical system will stay obedient long enough for the paper system to survive the stress. I think that is a bad assumption. It can start looking quietly for an off-ramp and then rebrand partial de-escalation as prudence, discipline, or strategic success. That lowers immediate pressure, but it also tells the world that Iran found the correct lever, or it can let the anti-Iran logic broaden into an anti-China logic. And then this becomes much bigger, much messier, and much more dangerous, not because China collapses, but because Russia backfills, Beijing adapts, and the rest of the world adjusts even faster to a future with less faith in American paper dominance. I still think the second path is the most likely, not because Washington is wise, because arithmetic beats rhetoric in the end. Oil is real, inflation is real, debt rollover is real, treasury demand is real, If the war keeps pressing on all four at once, the American system eventually has to choose between strategic pride and financial stability. Great powers always posture toward pride until the last possible moment. Then they retreat toward stability and invent a new story about why retreat was always strategy. That is the pattern I see here. The danger is not that Iran wins some cinematic military victory. The danger is that Iran proves something much more corrosive, that a weaker state sitting next to indispensable energy choke points can force the strongest financial power in the world to defend the credibility of its paper collateral against the reality of the physical world. And once that lesson is visible, everybody learns from it. Markets learn from it. Governments learn from it. China learns from it. Russia learns from it. Europe learns from it. The developing world learns from it. They learn that treasuries are still central, but not sacred. They learn that energy routes can still discipline finance. They learn that wars sold as regional containment can become global confidence tests. And they learn that Washington may still be strong enough to dominate headlines, but not strong enough to keep the material foundations of its system outside the war. That is why this warning is fatal, not because America collapses tomorrow, because the logic is cumulative. Every extra week of war raises the cost. Every extra spike in oil raises inflation pressure. Every extra inflation scare raises rate pressure. Every extra rates problem raises debt pressure. Every extra debt problem raises faith pressure. Strong systems are rarely broken by one blow. They are weakened by repeated moments when reality forces the paper to reprice. That is what Iran is trying to do. Now, not defeat America head on, force America to defend the paper collateral of its empire against the physical world. It still depends on. That is the real war inside this war. And when paper meets the choke point, the barrel prices the bond.